Hi, everyone. I'm Brenda Simmons, and with me today is
Bridget Griffin. Hi, everyone.
we work for the George Washington University as part of the National Technical Assistance Team with the National Technical Assistance Center on Transition, the Collaborative, or NTAC-C. Our center is co-funded by the U.S. Department of Education's Office of Special Education Programs, or OSEP, and the Rehabilitation Services Administration, or RSA. And we provide joint technical assistance and training for state VR agencies, as well as state and local education agencies, along with their partners, to improve outcomes for students and youth with disabilities. We'd like to welcome you to the final webinar of this micro training series that provides a quick overview of the 5 required pre-employment transition services, the VR continuum of services, and this presentation today, which focuses on coordination and collaboration with education. Each of these webinars are intended to introduce participants to the topic and offer a brief snapshot of things to consider when providing or arranging for the provision of pre-employment transition services to students with disabilities. Additional resources, tools, and webinars related to pre-employment transition services and transition services for students and youth with disabilities can be found on the NTAC-C website, transitionta.org. We also need to share this disclaimer, which states that although the content of this presentation was developed by NTAC-C, which is funded by the Department of Education, the contents do not necessarily represent the policy of the Department of Education, and you should not assume any endorsement by the federal government. So now I'm going to turn it to Bridget to get us started.
Yeah, thanks so much, Brenda. So I am going to get started by taking a brief look at the law and the regulations that surround coordination with education. So the law says that services must be coordinated between VR and education. How we execute the coordination is through effective collaboration, through building good working relationships. The reauthorization of the Rehabilitation Act in 1998 and in 2014 places the responsibility on VR to coordinate services with education officials. So what is coordination? Really, that is the act of making all of the people involved in a plan or activity work together in an organized way. In order to achieve the best possible outcomes for students with disabilities, the VR portion of the state plan must specifically address the plans, policies, and procedures for effective coordination between VR and the public education entities in the state. This is to ensure and facilitate the process for students with disabilities to transition successfully from the receipt of educational and pre-employment transition services while they're still in school to the receipt of VR services provided by the state VR agency. Furthermore, the plans, policies, and procedures just mentioned must outline that the individualized plan for employment will be developed and approved as early as possible during the transition process for an eligible student with a disability, and no later than the student leaves the school setting. In the case where an order of selection is in place, the IPE must be developed when the student is able to be served under that order of selection. Both the Individuals with Disabilities Act, IDEA, and the Rehabilitation Act, as amended by WIOA, require that state education agencies and VR agencies plan and coordinate transition services, as well as pre-employment transition services for students with disabilities through a formal interagency agreement. So that's actually laid down in law. The purpose of that agreement is really kind of what we talked about already, to facilitate and coordinate that smooth transition for students with disabilities from school to post-school activities. And it includes the receipt of pre-employment transition services, as well as transition services and other VR services. And it also serves as a mechanism for VR agencies, state educational agencies, and local education agencies to clearly specify the plans and policies and procedures for coordinating those services. So you got to write those things down. These include things like consultation and technical assistance, the roles and responsibilities of the different staff and agencies, the way you outreach to schools. So that's just some of the things that are covered in that plan. So when we have effective coordination in place, the individualized plan for employment developed by the student, family, and the VR staff member will take into consideration the student's IEP, so that's their individualized education program, or the 504 services that are being provided by the school. And there'll be some consistent and compatible goals and objectives. So how do you do that? So really what we need to do as agencies and with our education agencies is to acknowledge that the student is receiving services from more than one entity. We need to build the relationships with the other entity so that you can share plans with each other and discuss the student's progress. So there's a lot of back and forth there, and that's really important to the coordination of services. So furthermore, each local VR office must arrange these coordination activities that are designed to support that successful delivery of pre-employment transition services. So each pre-employment transition coordination activity focuses on a unique group of partners with whom to coordinate. So we've got schools, but also other partners that we coordinate with as well. So the first of those 4 coordination activities is attending individualized education program meetings when invited. Secondly, working with local workforce development boards, one-stops, and employers to develop work opportunities for students with disabilities. Working with schools to coordinate and ensure the provision of pre-employment transition services. And attending person-centered planning meetings for students with disabilities receiving services under medical assistance programs like Medicaid or Title 19 of the Social Security Act when invited to those meetings. These activities help to establish the people and the processes needed to provide pre-employment transition services for students. And I'm going to hand it back to Brenda.
Thanks, Bridget. So, wow, these new regulations really redefined the meaning of collaboration. This new focus on all of the ways that VR in education must now coordinate and collaborate when providing services to students with disabilities really changed the landscape for not only VR, but for state and local education agencies as well. For example, both VR and education have new responsibilities for providing increased access to students at an earlier age, for obtaining parental consent, and sharing student information. Since VR is now able to serve potentially eligible students with disabilities, there may be a different referral process or a different referral form for potentially eligible students versus those students who actually want to apply for VR services. So it's important to ensure that everyone knows, in this example, which doggone form to use and when to use it, so that students and families have a really clear understanding of the services that they are getting when they sign those forms. And perhaps most importantly, with the addition of the 5 required pre-employment transition services, that VR may now provide to students with disabilities the lines between what constitutes a VR pre-ETS activity and what transition services the student receives as part of the local education agency's responsibilities under IDEA can often become a little blurry. So it's really important for VR and education personnel at that local level to communicate closely with one another in coordinating these services to ensure that transition services are not being duplicated. but rather they build upon one another to help the student maximize the services needed to achieve those positive post-school outcomes. We used to use the analogy of a relay race when we talked about collaboration between VR and education, where education is running the first leg of that race and then hands off the baton to VR to finish the race, providing services to students as they are graduating or exiting secondary education. But that is sure not the case anymore. It's much more like a two-legged sack race, or in this picture with the two dogs, with each of them holding onto the same stick at the same time, right? In order to cross the finish line, in this case, it requires much more collaboration. And it's not about the handoff, but it's about being in sync with one another during the entire race. So VR must collaborate at the local level with the schools to arrange for the provision of pre-employment transition services for all of the students with disabilities who might need those services. We collaborate to identify the students. We collaborate to get the message out, to inform parents and guardians about available services, and to understand the particular services that are provided by each agency. So there's a lot of collaboration involved. So the regulations that Bridget talked about really defined the meaning of collaboration between VR and education. And we know now more than ever, effective communication and building strong relationships are the key to the successful delivery of not just pre-employment transition services, but all transition services. And not only are there regulations around collaboration with education officials, there are also regulations around the financial responsibilities of VR agencies and local education agencies. So we know that local education agencies are obligated to provide transition services under the IDEA. Local education agencies are also responsible for providing and paying for any transition service that's considered special education or related services necessary for ensuring a free, appropriate public education as required under IDEA. And nothing under Title I of the Rehab Act reduces that obligation of the local education agency to provide those services. Also, pre-employment transition services provided by VR agencies may not duplicate services that are already provided by local education agencies through IDEA. We know there are some really gray areas and crossover, right? So decisions as to who will be responsible for providing services that are both special education services and vocational rehabilitation services must be made at that state or local level as part of this collaborative process. And it's going to be further defined in that formal interagency agreement that Bridget just talked about. This can get a little tricky though, right? So to help state VR agencies and schools begin to walk through this process and work through this process just a little better and initiate conversations around which agency will provide what and when they're going to provide it, you might want to begin by asking a couple of guided questions. First of all, who's going to benefit from the service being provided? If you're using VR resources like VR staff or VR funds, can you ensure that only VR recipients are benefiting from those funds? That means only students with disabilities who've been determined eligible or potentially eligible. The second question, what is the intentionality of it? Since VR Pre-ETS services are so similar to education's transition services under IDEA, this is always a tough one to work through. You'll need to make decisions at both the state and local level about whether the service is related to an employment outcome or educational attainment, if it's considered a special education or related service, and is the service one that is customarily provided under IDEA or the Rehabilitation Act? It also depends on what the agency has done to avoid duplicating services. So, for example, have you clearly outlined the procedures to delineate what is a VR service from a service under IDEA? And have you provided staff guidance on how to make that determination at the local level? Is it clearly spelled out in your interagency agreement? Some of the things that we identified as strategies to reduce duplication of services, we talk a little bit about here on this slide. And they are absolutely not rocket science, right? But one of the things that sometimes we forget are some of these basic steps of communication to just talk to each other. And so some of the things that we identified here talk about how schools in VR can begin to plan for how pre-employment transition services can be provided to all students who need them. How are you going to begin that conversation? First of all, you're definitely going to want to review that student's class schedule with school personnel and identify any overlap with the provision of any of the 5 required pre-employment activities, right? That's an important piece. Try to get that information and talk with the school a little bit. You don't know if you're going to duplicate anything if you don't know what the student's already receiving, right? Then you're going to want to discuss specific activities that are within those 5 required pre-employment transition services that are not currently available to all students with disabilities at the school or might need to be strengthened based on individual student need to help fill those gaps. You're going to want to review the provision of pre-employment transition services to students on a very regular basis because things may change at the school, schedules may change. And so you're going to want to be able to make changes as needed as well, and then share that information with the school. The things you may be providing that VR may be providing under as one of the 5 required pre-employment transition services, those things might change too. So it's about sharing that information back to the school. And you're going to want to review student progress and student outcomes for each of the 5 required pre-employment transition services to determine if the student continues to need pre-employment transition services and how the continuum of VR services could support the provision of additional VR transition services and support IEP team planning. So here, we wanted to give you an example of what it might look like to begin to identify some of the work-based learning activities for pre-employment transition services that VR can do under the Rehabilitation Act versus some of the transition services schools can provide to students under IDEA. For example, VR might facilitate opportunities for students to obtain work experiences within an integrated setting by recruiting business mentors, developing paid work experiences for students, or creating internships. Whereas education might set up job shadowing activities or help students prepare for work by helping them complete applications and mock interviews. These are just a few examples. And as you can tell, many activities do not always fit clearly on one side or the other. But that's really the point of this slide. What happens if both education and VR are setting up job shadowing experiences for the students? Is that okay? Maybe, but it's going to depend on the specific activity that you're providing and how it's being conducted. This is an example of a simple mapping tool that can be used either at the school level or at the student level to map out what IDEA transition services are currently being offered by the school to the student, and also which of the 5 required VR pre-employment transition services are currently being planned or provided that might supplement those transition services the school is already providing in order to assist students in achieving their post-school outcomes. Another tool or resource that we wanted to share with you is the side-by-side guide of transition services. This document compares and contrasts the transition service requirements for education and VR, including pre-employment transition services that are consistent with the laws around those services. This is available on our INTAC-C website, and we've also embedded a direct link to this document at the bottom of the slide. States have shared with us that this has been a really helpful desk reference guide for both education and VR staff to use in the delivery of joint transition services, and also to simply communicate the differences and the similarities in service provision with parents, vendors, and other community partners. This guide helps folks develop an understanding of how state education and VR address the definition of transition services. It includes the target population served, the services provided, and it will also help folks learn how IDEA and WIOA support the collaboration between agencies in the provision of transition services and pre-employment transition services. So now I'm going to turn it back over to Bridget to highlight why all of this collaboration and coordination is so very important. Okay, Bridget?
Sorry, I forgot to unmute.
That's okay. That's a spot we can do. Keep going.
Okay, so Brenda, thanks so much for covering all of that. This slide begins to talk about the outcomes. And we know that outcomes are largely contingent on what you do at the very beginning. Outcomes for the VR program are very dependent on the services provided to our youngest clients. We know this because typically now across the country, the percentage of clients served by a VR agency, when combining both eligible and potentially eligible individuals, is at least 50% of the client base, if not more. So that tells you how important it is to have that early engagement with students. The foundation of the VR program is the principle that individuals with disabilities, including those with the most significant disabilities, are capable of achieving high-quality, competitive, integrated employment when provided the necessary services and supports. One of the core service objectives of WIOA is to provide America's workers with the skills and credentials necessary to secure and advance in employment, with wages that will sustain families and provide America's employers with the skilled workers needed for their businesses to succeed in a global economy. That increases the demand for workers with secondary and post-secondary credentials more than ever before. Credentials such as a diploma or a degree or apprenticeship are essential for anyone who wants a job that offers a good salary and advancement opportunities. It's true for all workers, regardless of zip code, race, income, or gender. Developing and strengthening collaborative partnerships with schools and other entities in the community results in a coordinated plan of service delivery to support students in achieving meaningful post-secondary employment and training outcomes. So what's the impact of successful coordination and collaboration on students? So we see greater family and student engagement. Coordination and collaboration supports earlier connection of students to VR and community resources. It supports the seamless delivery of unique services needed by the student that support or scaffold each other without needless duplication, as Brenda kind of talked about earlier. We also see student progress and outcomes, which are regularly measured and shared by schools and by the VR agency, helps to tailor the planning of future services. So that's really important, again, to avoid that duplication and really give the students the services that they need. Students are encouraged to make informed decisions about their career interests, their career pathways, and the services and training needed to help them achieve their goals, looking at their benefits and all sorts of factors that impact their outcomes. Some of the indicators of successful collaboration and coordination are that students are participating in post-secondary education and are connected to the support services offered by the college. Students are exiting programs with measurable skill gains and credentials. they're getting jobs in their fields of study, and they are applying for VR services. The bottom line is that when students succeed, we all do. So student success is being measured by those credentials we talked about, their career pathways, and their engagement in training, achieving those employability skills, and increases in self-determination and self-advocacy. For the education agency, they're seeing students who are actively engaged in school and are graduating at higher rates. They achieve their IEP and post-secondary goals and have successful post-school outcomes. For vocational rehabilitation, there's increased involvement with students at a younger age. Students then go on to apply for VR services earlier and have that assistance through an IPE and employment goal achievement. We see increases in competitive integrated employment, higher wages, and long-term employment success. And together, we're all meeting those WIOA common performance measures that we have set. So you can see that that kind of follows the students throughout. Bottom line, again, is that when students succeed, we all succeed. That is taking us right to the end of our presentation. We want to thank you very much for your engagement in this series, and we hope that it's helpful to you. Thank you.
Okay, Bridget, hang on. I'm trying to figure out how to stop sharing and stop recording. Hang on.